They said it was impossible. They said animals could never march like an army, united as one. And yet, under the blazing sun of Africa, something happened that the world could not explain. Tonight, you will witness the rise of a legend, the Great Migration, the rebirth of life itself. Before we begin this extraordinary journey, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because what you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a legend in the making. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. The world awoke to a sight no satellite had ever captured before. Africa's skies were darkened not by storm but by wings. Tens of thousands of birds, migrating in formation, shifted their ancient paths toward one point on the map. The savannas shook under the thunder of hooves, elephants, wildebeest, antelope, zebras, all converging as though summoned by an invisible call. From deserts, jungles, and mountains they came, predators and prey alike moving together, as though the laws of nature had bent overnight. At the heart of the migration lay something no one had believed possible, a river that had never existed before. A shining blue vein cut across Burkina Faso's dust-choked plains, where for centuries there had been only drought and despair. The river was new, yet it flowed with the certainty of something ancient, as if it had always been waiting beneath the earth for this moment. Global newsrooms erupted in chaos. Western scientists scrambled to explain how so many species had altered their migrations simultaneously. Military satellites zoomed in, broadcasting surreal images of the new river shimmering under the African sun. In Washington, Paris, and Brussels, leaders demanded answers. What had happened in Burkina Faso? Who had created this? And most terrifying of all, why were millions of animals answering its call? One name rose above the confusion, whispered in corridors of power with equal measures of awe and dread. Ibrahim Traoré. They had expected him to be just another soldier, a temporary leader, swallowed like countless others by history's tide. But Traoré was different. He carried himself with silence heavier than speeches, and when he stood before his people in his military uniform and red beret, they did not see just a man. They saw a storm gathering. Satellite images revealed more than water. They showed earthworks that could not have been built in secret without meticulous planning, a vast project connecting hidden aquifers and ancient underground channels. Rumors spread of tunnels dug during Thomas Sankora's era. Plans abandoned but never forgotten, now revived by Traoré's hand. To the west, it was unthinkable. An African leader commanding not just soldiers, but rivers. Yet to the people of Burkina Faso, it was a miracle. Mothers carried their children to the water's edge. Old men fell to their knees and wept. Farmers dipped their cracked hands into the flow, whispering prayers to ancestors who had died waiting for this very day. But even as the people rejoiced, the world beyond their borders trembled. Because if Traoré truly commanded a river, then perhaps he commanded the animals that followed it. And if he commanded life itself, then no empire was safe. What began as a mystery of nature was now something greater, something dangerous. And as the West braced itself for what came next, one truth became undeniable. Traoré had set something in motion that no one could stop. The land of Burkina Faso had long been betrayed by the sky. Seasons that once brought rain now delivered only dust. Rivers that once carved valleys were nothing more than scars of cracked clay. Generations had lived and died waiting for clouds that never came, their prayers swallowed by a horizon that grew crueler with every passing year. By the time Ibrahim Traoré rose to power, famine was no longer a threat, it was a permanent neighbor. Crops withered before they could bloom. Wells ran dry before a child's thirst could be quenched. Mothers buried their infants in shallow graves, whispering apologies for bringing them into a world where even water had abandoned them. The West offered solutions, but none that gave life. They promised loans, but demanded gold in return. They sent food aid, but only enough to create dependence. They advised patience, as though patience could fill empty stomachs. And all the while, beneath Burkina Faso's soil, something ancient waited, unseen, unheard, forgotten. Traoré's rise was not the story of a politician, but of a soldier who could not look away from his people's suffering. In his military uniform and red beret, he did not speak like a man chasing power. He spoke like a man who had lost patience with despair. His words were few, but his actions carried the weight of prophecy. When he visited villages, he walked barefoot among the dust. When he entered abandoned wells, he climbed down himself, lantern in hand. And when he stood before his people, he did not promise miracles. He promised work. But even work seemed impossible when the land itself had turned against them. It was then that whispers of an impossible dream returned. The dream of a hidden river. Older villagers remembered maps drawn in Sankara's time, secret plans to link forgotten aquifers, to carve channels that would allow the desert to bleed water once more. Those plans had been buried when Sankara himself was buried, dismissed as the fantasies of a visionary who had dared to think Africa could free itself. Yet in the late hours of night, in the flicker of candlelight, Traore studied those forgotten sketches. The story began in fragments. A team of miners claimed they had heard the rush of water beneath the stone. A farmer's well revealed strange current deep below the earth. An engineer recalled tunnels left half-built, abandoned when foreign lenders withdrew funding. Piece by piece, the picture emerged. Beneath Burkina Faso's scars lay veins of life, waiting to be opened. Traore did not announce his plan. He simply began. Convoys moved at night, carrying equipment across the desert under the watch of loyal soldiers. Engineers were summoned in secret, told only what they needed to know. Miners dug not for gold, but for water. The people saw nothing, but they felt something. An energy stirring, an anticipation that could not be explained. The West, however, noticed. Satellites caught glimpses of unusual activity. Intelligence reports spoke of hidden construction, of tunnels and trenches forming in the desert. Analysts scoffed, insisting it was impossible. No river can be built where there is no water. But the reports kept coming. Something was happening. And then one dawn a farmer's child screamed. Not out of fear, but out of shock. His hand, pressed into the dry earth, had come up wet. Within hours a trickle became a stream. Within days the stream became a current. And by the time the first week ended, the ground that had not known mercy for centuries now carried a ribbon of water, glistening under the unrelenting sun. Burkina Faso's people rushed to its banks in disbelief. Some knelt and drank directly from the stream. Others filled clay jars as though afraid it would vanish by nightfall. Old women sang, voices cracking as they cried. Children splashed until their mothers dragged them back. For the first time in decades, laughter echoed across a land that had forgotten joy. The West reacted with alarm. In Paris, an emergency meeting declared that Traore was destabilizing the region. In Brussels, officials whispered of unauthorized resource projects. In Washington, analysts reviewed satellite images of the water's course, fearful of what it meant. And the IMF sent a private message, dripping with threat. Your debts are unpaid. Do not waste resources on illusions. But the river was no illusion. It was real. It was growing. And as it spread across the land, something began to stir far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Animals, from hundreds of miles away, were on the move. Elephants in the Sahel, antelope in Ghana, even storks crossing the skies of Sudan, all turned south, their paths bending toward this new blue vein. Farmers who once feared their cattle would die of thirst now watched as herds of wild buffalo trod the same soil, as though guided by an unseen hand. It was a mystery no scientist could solve, but one that every villager understood. Life was returning, and all life, both human and animal, could feel it. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, in his military uniform and red beret, gazing at the waters he had unleashed. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply watched, as if he knew this was only the beginning. The river widened with each passing week, carving through the land like a blade of hope. Once barren fields now shimmered with dampness. Villages that had lived on the brink of death for decades found themselves sitting beside a miracle they had never dared to pray for. But while the people of Burkina Faso embraced the water with trembling gratitude, the world beyond their borders watched with fear. The migration had begun. At first, it was small. Herds of antelope appeared along the riverbanks, timid but drawn irresistibly to the flow. Then came wildebeest in their thousands, moving in lines that stretched beyond the horizon. Elephants followed, their massive bodies swaying as they lumbered toward the sound of rushing water. Birds blackened the skies, wheeling above in endless spirals before descending to rest by the river's edge. Soon, it became undeniable. Africa's greatest migration in recorded history was unfolding, and it was not toward the Serengeti, not toward any ancient path, but toward Traore's new river. Scientists were baffled. How had so many species, scattered across a continent, converged on the same point without communication? Some claimed it was magnetic fields, others muttered about instinct. But those who walked the riverbanks whispered a simpler truth. The animals knew because the earth itself had called them. News agencies broadcast surreal images, lions drinking shoulder to shoulder with zebras, storks resting beside vultures, elephants digging pools where fish began to spawn. It was as if the laws of predator and prey had been suspended in reverence to the water. The images electrified the world. In Western capitals, they were not seen as miracles, but as threats. In Paris, ministers stared at screens showing elephants bathing in the new river. "This isn't natural," one muttered. "It's orchestrated." The French president slammed his hand on the table. "If Traoré controls nature itself, then France has lost Africa." In Washington, analysts framed it differently. They spoke of ecological destabilization, warning that shifting animal patterns could disrupt trade, food security, and even migration flows of people. Behind their sterile language was fear. Fear that a man they had dismissed as a minor soldier now appeared to command forces far greater than armies. And then came the accusations. The IMF released a statement condemning Burkina Faso's reckless water project, claiming it diverted resources away from debt repayment. European diplomats whispered about unauthorized ecological engineering. French media smeared Traoré as a dictator who had stolen gold to build a vanity project. But beneath the politics lurked darker intentions. Satellite images showed Western mercenaries landing quietly in neighboring countries. Unmarked trucks crossed borders at night. Sabotage teams studied maps of the river's source, whispering of explosives and poisons. The West could not allow the river to survive. For every day it flowed, their control over Africa slipped further away. And yet, every attempt at sabotage faltered. A convoy of mercenaries vanished in the desert, swallowed by a sandstorm no forecast had predicted. Poison dumped into an upstream well was washed away by an unexpected surge, as though the river itself resisted intrusion. Soldiers reported strange encounters, lions circling saboteurs, elephants blocking paths, flocks of birds descending with unnerving precision. To the people, it was proof. They spoke in hushed voices around fires. "The animals are protecting the river. Traoré has called them." Meanwhile, within Burkina Faso, hunger still gnawed at the people. The river gave water, but food took time to grow. Children still cried through the night, and soldiers still buried their comrades after clashes with rebels. Hope had returned, but it had come with tension. Could the river truly save them? Or was it a cruel illusion, a last gasp before despair claimed them once again? In these uncertain nights, Ibrahim Traoré stood silently at the water's edge, his military uniform and red beret illuminated by moonlight. He watched the migration swell, thousands becoming tens of thousands becoming millions. Predators and prey alike moved in harmony, drawn together by something greater than survival. He did not explain it. He offered no speeches, but his people saw him there, and they believed he knew the truth. That this was not simply nature, but destiny. The West, however, grew desperate. France prepared sanctions. The IMF threatened to seize Burkina Faso's gold shipments. Mercenaries whispered of one final plan, not to poison or sabotage the river, but to destroy its very heart. And as the migration reached its peak, as the skies darkened with wings and the ground shook with hooves, a storm began to form on the horizon, a storm not of rain, but of men, machines, and betrayal. The skies had never been so alive. From horizon to horizon, wings beat in waves of thunder. The earth itself quaked beneath millions of hooves and padded feet. And yet, in the middle of this impossible harmony, something darker stirred, a force not of nature, but of men. For weeks, the West had failed to sabotage the river. Poison had been swallowed by unexpected floods, convoys lost to storms, agents cornered by beasts they could not outrun. But the time for subtlety had ended. Now they came with fire and steel. In the dead of night, unmarked trucks rolled across the border, their headlights shrouded. Inside them sat mercenaries, hardened, expressionless, carrying crates of explosives designed to obliterate dams, to collapse channels, to choke the river at its source. Above them, surveillance drones hummed, beaming images back to distant command centers in Paris, London, and Washington. The plan was simple: destroy the source, let the desert reclaim its dominance, and erase Traoré's miracle before it could become a legend. But nothing about the river was simple. As the trucks approached the excavation sites where the underground aquifers fed the new river, something uncanny happened. Elephants emerged from the darkness, tusks glinting in the moonlight. They did not charge, not yet. They simply stood, massive and immovable, blocking the road. The mercenaries fired into the air, shouted, revved engines. But the elephants did not move. They formed a wall of flesh and bone, as though commanded by an intelligence older than civilization itself. Elsewhere, lions prowled the edges of the convoy, their golden eyes glowing like embers in the night. Birds descended in thick clouds, battering drones until they crashed from the sky. It was chaos, a war not between men, but between men and the living force of the earth. And then Traoré arrived. He rode at the head of his soldiers, his military uniform gleaming with sweat, his red beret unmistakable under the moon. He dismounted, walking forward with the kind of calm that made men hesitate. In his silence, there was power. The kind of power that made mercenaries doubt their pay, their orders, even their own weapons. He stood at the river's edge, the water shimmering behind him like liquid fire. For a long moment he said nothing. The animals encircled him as if waiting for his command. The mercenaries raised their rifles. Explosives were set in the sand. A single order from their hidden handlers would unleash destruction. But then the storm broke. Clouds, heavy and black, rolled across the sky with unnatural speed. Lightning split the heavens, illuminating the battlefield in searing flashes. Rain, real rain, the kind Burkina Faso had begged for, poured down in torrents, soaking the desert, swelling the river into a roaring flood. The explosives fizzled uselessly, drowned before they could ignite. The mercenaries faltered. Their radios crackled with static. Their trucks, trapped in mud, began to sink. Soldiers loyal to Traoré surged forward, rifles raised, determination burning in their eyes. But before steel met steel, nature struck first. A herd of wildebeest thundered into the convoy, scattering men like leaves. Elephants charged, tusks shattering trucks as though they were toys. Lions leapt from the shadows, tearing through lines of soldiers who had thought themselves predators. Above it all, birds shrieked and swirled, blotting out the moon, a living storm that blinded the invaders. It was not a battle. It was annihilation. Traoré did not lift a weapon. He stood unmoved, rain dripping from his beret, eyes fixed on the chaos. It was as though he had expected this moment, as though he knew the river would defend itself, and him. By dawn, the mercenaries were gone. Some had fled into the desert, their bodies swallowed by shifting sands. Others lay broken in the mud, their weapons rusting beside them. The river roared louder than ever, swollen by the storm, carrying away the debris of the attack. And the animals, they remained. Elephants still drank, wildebeest still grazed, birds still circled overhead. To the people who witnessed it, there was no doubt. Traoré had become more than a man. He was the river's guardian, and the river was his. But beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, in western capitals, the mood was panic. The footage could not be hidden. Leaked satellite images showed mercenaries torn apart by beasts, convoys drowned in floods, drones falling from the skies. The impossible migration had become undeniable. The world had seen Africa's animals rise in unison to defend a river, and behind it all, they had seen Ibrahim Traoré, standing untouched in his red beret. Panic turned to rage. The IMF demanded his immediate removal. France threatened intervention. Western media declared him a tyrant who had unleashed chaos upon nature. but none of it mattered. For in Burkina Faso, his people saw only one truth. The river lived, and so did they. The climax had passed, but its echoes would resound far beyond the desert. The sun rose over the Sahel like a quiet fire, spilling gold across the land. The storm had passed, yet its fingerprints remained. The earth was wet, the river swollen, the air rich with the scent of rebirth. Where once there had been dust, now there was mud. Where once there had been silence, now came the cries of life. The people of Burkina Faso awoke to a miracle. Mothers carried buckets to the riverbanks where fresh water surged, sparkling with the reflections of storks and herons. Children splashed in the shallows, their laughter echoing across the fields where new shoots of green pierced the soil. Farmers, long bent under the weight of drought, knelt in disbelief as they watched their land drink again, and everywhere, animals moved. Herds of wildebeest, once thought confined to distant plains, thundered alongside cattle. Giraffes bent their long necks to sip from the water. Elephants carved paths through forests that had begun to bloom where desert had ruled. Predators and prey alike had woven themselves into the rhythm of the river, and the people, instead of fearing them, came to see them as guardians of the land. At the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré. He wore his military uniform, his red beret tilted with quiet defiance. But there was something different about him now, less a commander of soldiers, more a figure of legend. When he walked the riverbanks, the people cheered not only for their leader, but for the man who had brought life where the world had only expected death. Yet far beyond Burkina Faso, the ripples were spreading. In Paris, footage of mercenaries scattered by wildebeest had been replayed in secret government chambers. In Washington, analysts stared in disbelief at satellite images of animal herds moving in patterns that looked almost coordinated. London's tabloids screamed of Traoré's pagan army and the curse of Africa's new river. But underneath the mockery lay fear. For if a single man, young and unyielding, could bend the flow of nature and inspire the poorest of nations to resist, what would stop others from rising? Already signs appeared. In Mali, chants of solidarity filled the streets. Our river too will rise. In Niger, farmers dug trenches, hoping to mimic Burkina Faso's miracle. Across the continent, young men and women whispered Traoré's name with reverence, as though he were not just a president, but a prophet. And still, the West pressed back. The IMF froze Burkina Faso's reserves. France withdrew aid. Trade sanctions choked imports. Media outlets labeled Traoré a dictator drunk on myth. Yet these attacks seemed almost powerless. For each sanction, the river gave a counter-gift. Food where there had been famine. Fish where there had been emptiness. Trade routes as caravans of animals drew tourists and merchants from neighboring lands. Burkina Faso was no longer begging. It was building, but there was more, a mystery unsolved. A truth that turned whispers into legends. Elders told stories of Sankara, the revolutionary whose blood once watered this soil, and they claimed Traoré had completed his unfinished dream. Some swore the river was not entirely man-made, that it had been sleeping beneath the desert, waiting for a leader bold enough to awaken it. Others said the animals had not merely migrated, they had returned, guided by an unseen hand. Traoré never explained. When asked, he would only smile faintly and say, "The river belongs to Africa. It knows its time." And so the legend grew. Years later, historians would debate whether it was science or faith, coincidence or destiny. They would argue about aquifers, migration cycles, rainfall anomalies. But for the people who lived it, no explanation was needed. They had seen a man stand against empires. They had seen rivers flow where none had flowed before. They had seen animals march like an army, not of men, but of nature itself, and they had seen hope return. As the sun set on that new era, children sat by the banks telling stories of the night elephants stopped bullets, of the storm that drowned fire, of the lions who walked beside soldiers. And in the center of every story stood one figure, Ibrahim Traoré, in his military uniform, his red beret catching the light of dawn. He had not merely defended his people. He had given them a vision of what Africa could be, untamed, united, unbroken. And so the final question lingered. like a whisper across the desert wind. Was this the day Africa began to rise? Not with chains of steel, but with the river of life? The answer would not come from books, or leaders, or even rivers. It would come from the people themselves. And in their eyes, as they gazed upon the flowing waters, the answer was already written.